Our subscribers get it, with exclusive access to breaking news, briefs, reactions, opinion, and process. iPolitics. Are you up for it?
Hi, welcome back to the iPolitics Pre-Budget Podcast. Our guests are Scott Clark, former Deputy Minister of Finance, and Pete DeVries, his trusted ally and economist for many, many years at the department. Gentlemen, I asked you as we went out from the last segment, what are your fearless predictions for this week's budget?
Well, I see this budget as being a housekeeping budget in some ways, to clean up a bunch of irritants or a bunch of issues that they don't want to have hanging around when they enter into a surplus environment and want to get ready for the election. In the speech from the throne, they did announce a bunch of things that they wanted to do over their mandate. One of them was to introduce balanced budget legislation. So I suspect that we will see the specifics of that in this budget. There's things that with respect to the public service. Their key aim seems to be to control the costs of wages and salaries, the whole compensation package for public service. So we could see things in that. We've seen some stuff already with amendments to the Public Sector Relations Act, but we could see more in this budget. But I suspect much of it will be things that they want to get out of the way before they start tackling the big issues, the big policy issues leading into the next election.
I don't think there'll be any more restraint exercised in this budget. Remember, in the fall update, they extended the freeze on operating budgets, so that was a pretty significant move. Didn't even happen in the budget, it happened in the fall update. And I think now that there's more than enough expenditure restraint in the system, although we're not sure what it is because even the parliamentary budget officer couldn't find out exactly where they were cutting or not. But as we know just the last week with the issue of veterans, that's an area where they cut for a small amount of money. So I think they're now kind of sensitive, a little bit, hopefully, to what the impacts are of restraint. So I don't think there'll be any more major cutting, and I'm not sure that there's no need for it, and I don't think there are areas for it. I think just following on Peter's point is that the real budget will be 2 months later with the omnibus bill. That's been the case in 2013 and 2012, where you read the budget, and then 2 months later in 2012, we had a 1,000-page omnibus bill. After the 2013 budget, another large omnibus bill. So I think we would be saying, when we go into lockup, we'll read it.
Stay tuned.
Stay tuned, and maybe late March or April, we'll see the real budget.
So what is the difference from, let's go back 15, 20 years when the budget would come out, and it was what you see is what you get. It was all printed in those wonderful perfect bound books that line all our shelves. These days, there seems to be much less legislation, much more regulation that gets put into these budgets. How is the process different? And from a bureaucrat's standpoint, what does that mean?
Well, I think the last few budgets have been more really political documents rather than policy documents. When you go through the 500-odd pages in the budget plan, which details the initiatives, or should detail the initiatives that the government wants to propose for the upcoming year, you see very few of those now. But you see a lot of rhetoric of how well we're doing, how we're number one on this and number one on that. There's not a lot of policy discussion in those budget documents anymore. So that's a big change from what happened in the past, where they would announce the initiatives, they would explain the initiatives in quite a bit of detail. So when you came out of that lockup, you knew pretty well what the government was going to do and how it was going to do it. That's not the case today.
I think certainly when you look back in the 80s and the 90s, and hate to date ourselves as Peter and I have lived through both those decades, and
I covered them.
and that covers the Mulroney era, the Conservative era in the 80s, and Mr. Chrétien and Mr. Martin during the 90s. But I think those two governments in those 2 decades engaged in more serious consultation. The governments put out issues papers, the discussion papers. And James, you remember, they used to come in different colors and everything. There was a lot of serious pre-budget consultation. And you could see that in the budgets and the way they were written. And Peter's quite right. Even in the 80s under Mr. Wilson and Mr. Mulroney, or Mr. Martin, now Mr. Chrétien, in the 90s after we did the 95 budget, then we had the education and the research and infrastructure budgets entirely devoted to that theme. Then we had the health budget, and then we had the tax cut budget. So each one was very strategic. There was a lot of detail. Everything was laid out very clearly. I think that distinguishes both the previous Liberal Conservative governments from the current government. We didn't have 1,000-page omnibus bills. We maybe had 100-page omnibus bills, but by today's standards, we were kind of minor league, I would say.
The other thing as well is that there was a lot more, how should I say, briefings before a budget. The people, there were no real surprises in budget, especially in the Chrétien Martin era, whereby you had a fairly good idea walking into that budget what the major themes were going to be, as Scott said, what the major policy initiatives were going to be. Now it's sort of, we don't know what's happening when you get into the budget, and we really don't know what's happening when we get out of the budget lockup either, because of the fact that the real gritty details are included in the budget omnibus bill and not in the budget documents per se.
It used to be that to be included in the omnibus bill, it had to be referred to in the budget documents. And we have to admit, even when we did it, it wasn't always clear, but it was certainly clearer. This government includes in its omnibus bills things that are never referred to in the budget. So omnibus bills have become something, a whole new kind of phenomena from this government. I mean, they put everything in there to ram it through Parliament without having the appropriate, in our view anyhow, review by committee and so forth as separate pieces of legislation. And a good example is where 6 months after the omnibus bill and after the budget, they had to put in the omnibus bill special provisions to get changes for the appointment of Supreme Court judges.
Now, there may be a bit of change coming now because we've had 2, if not 3 pieces of legislation put before Parliament in the last, well, since they've come back from their winter recess as well as before. The Fair Elections Act, or the Fair Elections Act, the Citizenship Act. So, you know, one would have, under this government, expected those to be buried somewhere in the budget plan
really
and then
spending.
coming later. They're not spending, but they could be contentious. And if you want something to be passed quickly, you put it in a budget omnibus bill because there is that vote of confidence on a budget bill, whereas not a vote of confidence on a citizenship bill.
Unless they call it that way, yeah. Well, we'll take a quick break here and come right back with more fearless predictions for Tuesday's budget.